Hola, bona tarda a tothom. Soc Magda Anglès, editora de Les Afueres. Moltes gràcies a tots els que ens acompanyeu avui en aquesta tarda plujosa aquí a Barcelona, en aquest acte organitzat per la Fundació Institut d'Estudis Nord-americans, amb la col·laboració
Con la colaboración de la editorial.
El diàleg d'avui, que porta per títol La figura de la mare en la literatura nord-americana, té dues convidades excepcionals. La professora Anna Casablancas i l'escriptora Jane Lazarre. Hola, Anna. Hello, Jane. És un gran honor poder presentar a les dues
A las dos
participantes.
participantes de esta sesión.
Anna Casablancas és doctora en literatura anglesa per la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. En la seva recerca acadèmica ha explorat els principals corrents feministes sobre la maternitat al segle XX. La seva tesi doctoral va abordar el tema de la maternitat en la literatura, centrant-se en el cas de la novel·lista britànica Doris Lessing, una escriptora que també va marcar en el seu moment a Jane Lazarre, la nostra segona convidada. Jane Lazarre és una de les veus més importants de la literatura nord-americana actual. El nudo materno, que tinc aquí al meu costat, va ser publicat el 1976 als Estats Units i traduït a l'espanyol per primer cop per Les Afueres el 2018. És un llibre fonamental per entendre com ens travessa la maternitat. El llibre recull les memòries de l'autora com a mare i relata les seves contradiccions davant les idees preconcebudes sobre la maternitat. Sempre a través d'experiències personals i de la memòria familiar, en el conjunt de l'obra de Jane Lazarre s'ha analitzat altres aspectes claus del món contemporani, com la pervivència del racisme, en les seves memòries Beyond the Whiteness of Whiteness, o l'herència política del comunisme, com a les memòries El comunista i la hija del comunista, que recentment hem publicat a Les Afueres. A més de no-ficció, també he publicat les novel·les següents: Inheritance, Someplace Quite Unknown, The Powers of Charlotte, Worlds Beyond My Control, tots reeditats per Hamilton Stone Editions. Lazarre, que viu a la ciutat de Nova York, des d'on es connecta avui, és, de fet, una de les responsables que el meu company Francisco Llorca i jo mateixa acabéssim decidint-nos a muntar l'editorial Les Afueres. Recordo comprar la primera edició de The Mother Not, que és aquesta d'aquí, i que vaig devorar amb avidesa. Va ser una sorpresa molt gran trobar-nos amb un testimoni tan honest, tan visceral i íntim sobre la maternitat, que havia estat escrit als anys 70, però era plenament vigent al segle XXI. A més, també ens va sorprendre i interessar moltíssim la barreja de gèneres que el feien una obra realment inclassificable. Hi havia memòria, hi havia assaig, ficció, autoficció. Un tema, la barreja de gèneres, que de segur que es tractarà avui aquí. Tant al Francisco com a mi ens semblava inexplicable que aquest text no circulés entre els lectors en castellà i va ser un dels primers títols que vam editar a Les Afueres. El nudo materno va avui per la 5a edició i tant aquí com a Llatinoamèrica segueix trobant lectores i lectors molt entregats. Així que és una bona ocasió per agrair-li profundament a la Jane tot el seu suport i generositat al llarg d'aquests anys a Les Afueres. Abans de començar el debat, m'han demanat que comuniqui als participants que a la part inferior de la pantalla hi trobareu una bola del món i que si cliqueu podeu decidir en quina llengua voleu escoltar la conferència, en cas que vulgueu activar un dels intèrprets, en castellà o en català. També podeu decidir si voleu escoltar l'original clicant a l'anglès o a off. Si activeu el xat, podreu compartir preguntes i comentaris al final de la sessió amb tots nosaltres. Finalment, voldria donar les gràcies a Mercè Segura, directora de l'Institut d'Estudis Nord-americans, l'Helena Garcia, als intèrprets i a totes les persones que han fet possible aquesta trobada avui. Amb això, dono la paraula a la professora Anna Casablancas. Moltes gràcies.
Okay, thank you very much, Magda. So can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so let's start. Well, during this talk, I will be providing lots of reading suggestions about motherhood in the literature of the United States. And well, if you want to take note of this and you don't have time to take notes, don't worry, because we are going to provide a list of readings in the website, okay, in the Institute website, right? And I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation just in case you want to remember something or take note of something. It will be available for all of you in our website, okay? So let's start. I'm going to share this presentation for all of you. Right. Well, this is the first page is the picture with Jane Lazarre and the title of our presentation today. So I'm going to start talking about the mother figure in the literature of the United States from the very beginning. So let's start with the Scarlet Letter, 1850, which is, you know, very old. But why is the figure of motherhood important in this text? Well, as you know, the Scarlet Letter is at the very beginning, at the very origin
Como sabéis, la letra escarlata fue muy importante en el comienzo de la literatura estadounidense. Fue un texto fundacional muy arquetípico sobre los primeros colonizadores, sobre los puritanos.
I a partir dels quals es va iniciar la cultura dels Estats Units. La figura de la mare que veiem en aquest text la podem veure en aquesta il·lustració, amb la lletra escarlata brodada al pit. Es considera la dicotomia entre la pecadora i la santa. És adúltera, però al mateix temps també té algunes virtuts.
Modeled after the figures of the Virgin Mary and also of Eve, the first sinner, right? So she embodies in a way the dichotomy between the virgin and the whore, right? This contradiction that she has to go beyond if she wants to get an identity of her own, right? This contradiction is the very beginning, the very origin of the contradiction we still have nowadays between being a mother and being a woman, being motherly in a way, or being sensual in another way, right? This separation that we still can see today in the 21st century. Why is this picture important? Well, this is a picture after the Scarlet Letter. It is from 1861, in which we can see the figure of Hester Prynne portrayed as a Madonna, right? So we could, if we didn't have this letter here on her bosom, we could think that this was a Renaissance painting of the Virgin Mary, the child, right? So what does it mean? It means that even though she was the sinner, she was embodying the figure of motherhood that is all love, all patience, etc. And this is at the very origin of this mother figure that we have in the literature. We go on in history, we can find this work, Little Women, 1868. Well, generations of women have grown with this reading. And even though we have one of the protagonists, Jo March, who is creative, who is opposed to the stereotype of women at the time, the first image that comes to our mind when we think about Little Women is this one. Well, these are different images from different cinema adaptations of the movie, of the book, sorry. But what they have in common is the mother you know, as the center of this family. This is the type of mother that we have in the literature at the time. A mother that is always helping, always, well, she has got infinite patience. She is the provider of well-being. She's always supervising any problem that her children may have. She's supervising every single heartbreak that they have. So this is a model of a mother that is pictured, that is modeled after the figure of the angel in the house that was imported from Victorian literature into the States. This mother that is at the center of the family and that is the provider of love and care for everybody, and trying to educate her children to be virtuous, to be generous, etc. So that was the stereotype, and we can see how normative motherhood was based on this figure of the mother, even though at this time we already had the first examples or the first wave of feminism, right? This, what we can see in this picture is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. That was the first hints of a feminist movement that was based on the political sphere, right? So what they wanted, or their fight, was for women's suffrage that was only achieved 70 years later in 1920 with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, right? So the important thing about this feminism is that they were fighting for legal representation. They were fighting for the role of women in politics, but they didn't talk about what was happening inside the home, right? They didn't talk about the private life of these people. And at this moment is when Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments that was somehow copied from the Declaration of Independence, which says, we hold this truth to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Well, she wrote, we hold this truth to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they were fighting for this equality in the legal, social, and political sphere, right? And that didn't transcend to other spheres of women's existence. But at the time, we can already see some voices that start talking about what was happening, not outside the woman, but inside, what was happening inside the family and inside the minds of women who were mothers and who were wives. One example is this tale, this short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which was published in 1892, in which we can see this woman who has nervous breakdowns and is prescribed a cure of rest, a rest cure, right? And what she's prescribed after feeling so stressed in her domestic life is resting and not being creative at all, right? So in a paper that she wrote some years later called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, she said that this wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, to which still good physique responded so promptly that he concluded there was nothing much the matter with me and sent me home with solemn advice: live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as I lived. So the prescription for being stressed out in this domestic sphere was like banning any type of intellectual life. So enclosing this woman in her domesticity and not having anything to do outside the family, which derives in hallucinations and madness on her part. Another important thing is that while she is in this rest cure, she cannot have access to her child. And this becomes a contradiction. The fact that she had been having these nervous breakdowns because of domesticity, and she needed to rest from her family, but at the same time, she felt so bad not having access to her child. So this, here we can start seeing the contradictions of motherhood. On the one hand, as being something very demanding, but on the other hand, something that you need once you have become a mother. Other voices that we can hear talking about other types of motherhood, apart from the angel in the house, are these two. The Awakening by Kate Chopin is a very interesting story about a mother who rediscovers her own sensuality after years of being a mother and a wife. So in this text, we can see very clearly this dichotomy between being a woman and being a mother. So in a way, we can see here how sensuality is seen as separate from motherhood. So what the author wants to tell us, in a way, is that womanhood, or being a woman, does not only depend on being a mother. So we can have different aspects of our identity apart from being mothers. And then we also have this text by Willa Cather, My Antonia, which is about the pioneers going west. This is a tale of growing up from girlhood to womanhood, in which we have some roles, some characters who don't want to be mothers, and so they express it. But then we have Antonia, who chooses to stay in her farm, get married, and be the mother of 7 children. Even though she's a mother in the traditional way, we can see how this is her personal choice, and how she works so hard to manage everything and to run her farm and run her family. And she's seen as a very strong character who chooses to be a mother and who can cope with everything. So this is a bit different from the angel in the house, which in fact she is, but she goes beyond that because she has much more responsibility than just being this provider of care and love to the family. And finally, another example that I wanted to mention is John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, in which we can see this character, Rose of Sharon, who is kind of obsessed about her motherhood and her pregnancy, and she cannot think about anything else. But then at the end, her child is stillborn, she loses her child, and the very last part of it is a very powerful image in which we see how she sees a man who is starving, and what she offers is to breastfeed him, right? So why is this important? Because here we can see an example of the power of the motherly body, right? The maternal body that can save a life, that has the power to save the life of this man. So in this text that is written by a man, we can see the power of motherhood in a way. And well, all these examples that I have brought so far are examples of different types of motherhood or different images of motherhood that do not conform to the norm of this angel in the house that we could see previously. So if we see all these models, we can think about the evolution of this mother figure, which is not a linear one. The evolution of the mother figure is plural in the sense that we have different images that depend on different characteristics of the mother and different views or different pictures of what motherhood means. So we go to, this developed up to the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. This is the time of the personal is political. So what does it mean? Well, this sentence, the personal is political, was written by this woman, Carol Hanisch, in 1970. And this somehow summarizes the spirit of this second wave feminism. This means the personal is political means that in a way, what happens in the domestic sphere is important because it determines the role that women will have in society. So it's necessary to have a look at what happens at home, and this domestic sphere has to be taken into account politically in order to trigger some social change. This was the time, well, in the 60s, when women started asking for equal pay, equal employment opportunities. And well, somehow the power to decide on their motherhood or on their mother potential. So one very important thing is that the contraceptive pill was commercialized in 1961. So that was a first step towards this liberation of women who could start deciding on their domestic life and, of course, on their social and working life. So at this time, there were lots of essays written by women. Women were working quite a lot and writing quite a lot on these matters. And we have a bunch of essays talking about this. And I'm going to mention two of them that are very important. The first one is Adrienne Rich of Woman Born, in which we find in which she defined the difference between motherhood as experience and as an institution. So the institution of motherhood is the concept of motherhood itself. But then what she said is that this motherhood institution was experienced in a very different way depending on each woman and depending on the circumstances of each woman, which is something that we have already seen in all these texts that I have been mentioning. So this is very important because from this moment onwards, we can see how we shouldn't be talking about motherhood, but we should be talking about motherhoods in plural. So all these different experiences of different people can be summarized or can build up our notion of what motherhood is as an institution. And another very important text is this one, Nancy Chodorov's The Reproduction of Mothering, in which she mentioned that women's identity is always relational, which means that women feel their own identity as depending on the relationships they have to other people, and in this case, to the family. And another important idea in this text is that motherhood or the institution of motherhood is reproduced generation after generation, that women seek examples in their mothers and their grandmothers to as role models as regards to motherhood. So this is the time when Jane Lazarre wrote her The Mother Knot. Well, she, as Magda has already said, Jane Lazarre is the author of a lot of different books. I'm going to focus on this one because I think this may be familiar to us because you may have read it because it's translated into Spanish. It was published in Spanish 3 years ago, and it's a very well-known book, and it's a classic. And the thing is that this was published on the same year as Adrienne Rich published Of Woman Born. And the idea in this, the central idea in this text is the same one. Jane Lazarre here explains her own experience, her own personal experience of motherhood, which depends on her own circumstances at the time, which are different from other circumstances of other people. Something very interesting in this edition that we have here is Adrienne Rich's words, this edition, saying, "A wholly original and important book. I cannot imagine a woman who would not be moved and a man who would not be enlightened." So it's very important that Adrienne Rich was giving her opinion and praising this work. And what is interesting is the fact that both books were published on the same year. So, well, we're going to talk about this later on with Jane Lazarre, but it would be interesting to see whether one influenced the other, or perhaps their similarity is because of the social moment they were living with all these writings by feminist authors and all these social changes regarding motherhood and regarding feminism. And here we have a quotation talking about how the personal experience of this mother in the Mother Knot was different from the experience that other women had who conformed more to the normative type of motherhood, who were criticized both by feminists, but also were criticized by more traditional voices. In fact, one of the important issues in this text is the guilt or mother blaming, in a way, the fact that everybody criticizes you when you are a mother and you want to educate your children, and you do it and you do your best to educate your children, but you always feel that you are mistaken because everybody dares to criticize you and your work as a mother. Well, other works by Jane Lazarre here in this slide: Worlds Beyond My Control, Inheritance, Beyond the Whiteness of Whiteness. These have already been mentioned by Magda before. So let's go on to more works about motherhood. Here we have Tilly Olsen's works. Tilly Olsen was very important to Jane Lazarre because she was one of her main influences. She was very influential in her time, and she was talking about struggles of women and working class families. And Tilly Olsen was very politically active. In this text, Tell Me a Riddle, we can find 4 different short stories, and 3 of them are told from the perspective of the mother. And one of the tales that I want to recommend you is I Stand Here Ironing, which is a devastating narrative about the sense of guilt, of mother blaming, and the fear that all mothers have to ruin their child with the education that we are providing. It's also very interesting the fact that in the edition, in the Spanish edition, published by Las Afueras, you can find a preface by Jane Lazarre herself. And then there's this other work by Tilly Olsen, which is Silences, about literature, which is very influential on Jane Lazarre and is a study of literature of working class people and women, and how those at social disadvantage because of their race, their gender, their class can be silenced in literature. So we can see here different issues apart from feminism and motherhood. And then in fiction at this time, one of the most important works is The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, which tells the story, well, we have a girl who is the narrator and tells the story of her mother, along with a retelling of traditional Chinese folk tales. And in here, we can see all the different types of hardships that women have to endure because they are women. So far, in the 70s, what we can see in the works by Jane Lazarre, Tilly Olsen, Hong Kingston, is that there are different issues apart from feminism, apart from being a woman or being a mother, that intertwine. So this is what developed into the third wave of feminism, that can be summarized with this image, which says we all can do it, we all can do it. And then here we have this sentence: feminism is worthless without intersectionality and inclusion. What is this intersectionality, which is at the core of third wave feminism? Well, this refers to all the different layers that oppress women, that had already seen by Jane Lazarre, by Olsen, and all these feminist writers. So third wave feminism talks not only about womanhood, but also about class, race, single motherhood, all these type of things. And they were fighting for against violence against women, sexual liberation, maternity leave policies, and all these type of things that affected women of different origins and different social classes. And at this moment in the fiction, where we have figures like Toni Morrison, who was the Nobel Prize in 1993, who was a writer and activist. So at this point of my talk, we can see how writing about motherhood is always, or is often, linked to activism for other types of goals. Well, Toni Morrison has many works dealing with motherhood, like Sula, Mercy, some others, but the central one is Beloved, which is set in the 19th century and tells us a story that is related to slavery. And we follow this woman, this mother who kills her child to avoid her being enslaved. And then the ghost of her child haunts her in a very American Gothic type of way, altering her sense of identity, altering all her family ties. So we can see here how Sether, this woman, builds her own personality, her own identity, depending on the relationship to her child and to the rest of her children, who are her future, but who are also her past, because, well, this murder of her child is haunting her and doesn't allow her to go on in a way. It's very important to see how Toni Morrison links this story to slavery. I forgot to tell you before that other models of motherhood can be seen in other types of literature, like slave narratives, in which we can see motherhood, or this link between mother and child in this context of enslaved Americans. And one of the most important texts in this respect is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harry Jacobs, which deals very much about this, about womanhood in slavery. We cannot forget this, all these voices that come from the American slaves as well. Other works, well, I will be quite quickly because we need to talk to Jane Lazarre after this. So other works are Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, in which we see 4 mothers and 4 daughters, who are, the daughters are first generation Americans who come from China, and how the relationship between mothers and daughters depend on their cultural views, depending on well, their Chinese origin and their integration into the United States. And then we have the case of Maya Angelou, which I think is very interesting. This writer, who is also an activist for race and class, has got this 6-volume autobiography in which she shows her relationship to her mother, but also her relationship to her son, her being a single mother, a single Black mother. Well, motherhood is central to this 6-volume autobiography. But the interesting thing is that at the end, she wanted to include a 7th volume, which is Mom and Me and Mom, because she needed to write another book, another novel about her relationship to her mother, as if she hadn't had enough with 6 volumes of biography. And then another important book is Letter to My Daughter, in which she offers us lots of sketches, essays, poetry for all women that may hear her. And she puts herself in the position of being the mother to all of them because of her experience of life, giving examples and giving advice to all women. Finally, I just wanted to mention a couple of reading suggestions. These are the most recent, some of the most recent books. This is 21st century literature. The first one, Everybody Has a Story, which deals very much with class. It's about the collective crisis of 2008. We can see the evolution of identities under pressure, and the central character in this story is a mother as the center of the family. The mother of a family who have achieved the American dream and now have to face unemployment and the loss of their home. And then another one, which is Memorial Drive, which is the memoir of a daughter who tells the murder of her mother by her second husband. So it talks very much about violence against women, and also pressures for race, and the fact of being the daughter of an illegal interracial marriage in the United States. And then finally, before we go to our interesting talk and dialogue with Jane Lazarre, I wanted to show you this quote by Maya Angelou in Letter to My Daughter. She starts her volume by saying, well, she puts herself in the position of being the mother to all women. And she says, I gave birth to one child, a son, but I have thousands of daughters. You are Black and white, Jewish and Muslim, Asian, Spanish speaking, Native American, and Aleut. You are fat and thin and pretty and plain, gay and straight, educated and unlettered, and I'm speaking to you all. Here is my offering to you. So in this quote, we can see a couple of things that we haven't seen in this talk so far, which is, one is the surrogate mothers, or surrogacy, that means substitute mothers, people or women performing the role of mothers to other people, like she's trying to do in this in this novel, well, in this work. And then another important thing is the fact that motherhood, as she shows it, can be said to be cross-racial, right? And inclusive, because if she's the mother to all these women who are from different origins, it means that sometimes motherhood can be across cultures and across races. And this is when I want to finish my presentation and start the conversation with Jane Lazarre, because, well, Jane, when I read your essay, the whiteness of whiteness, beyond the whiteness of whiteness, you told us about your experience of being a white mother of Black sons. And you were telling us that when you try to talk to your children, when they were sad about this racial discrimination, and you try to understand them and talk to them about this, your son told you, yes, but you cannot understand because you're white. And this is what I wanted to talk about at the beginning of our talk, because you told me that you were very much interested in talking about motherhood, but also talking about race. So how did you live this difference between you and your children?
Okay, hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Anna, for your whole talk and for your references to my work. I really appreciate it very much. As far as, so for me, being a mother and being a white mother of Black sons who are now one is in his 40s and the other one is 51. So, and I have a almost 20-year-old granddaughter. So it's a very long journey that we're talking about. The moment in the mother knot, it describes giving birth and being pregnant and the very early years of becoming a mother and all of the conflict and ambivalence and tremendous love, but also loss of self that experience involved, which very few people were writing about then, as you said. But I felt the need to write the story as it really felt true to me. But since my husband of 53 years now was is Black and African-American, my children were Black and they were sons. And as we all know, I think from contemporary life right now, young Black men are now and always have been very endangered in the world. So there was a great deal that I had to learn about race. The moment that you describe, that is in Beyond the Whiteness of Whiteness, is a moment that was very dramatic. But it's only one moment among a lifetime of moments. So from the time they were very young, I started learning from African-American friends and my husband, and in particular my mother-in-law, a figure who's often described negatively in literature, but she had been one of my best friends all my life. She's now 97 and still going strong. And and through study and teaching, I learned a great deal about what it meant to be a Black person in this country from slavery on, as you described. So even though that is an authentic moment that you describe, really most of my life as a mother has been one of increasing intellectual, but also emotional understanding of what it means to be a Black person of any gender in the United States and probably in the world. So I think that both of my sons now, and certainly my husband, would say that I understand deeply what it means to be them, just like they understand very deeply what it is to be maybe a Jewish woman who's the daughter of an immigrant. So that's what happens in intimacy, as you've talked about.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to ask you something else about, well, and linking the conversation to literature and the works I have been mentioning. In your preface to the Spanish edition of Tilly Olsen's Tell Me a Riddle, you mentioned that after having your first baby, you were seeking books by female authors, also mothers who narrated the contradictions of motherhood, like love, fear, rage, and guilt, and these things, and that Tilly Olsen provided you with a language that included all this. Can you explain this in the case of Tilly Olsen, and as well how you see these contradictions that you depict in your book, The Mother Knot?
When The Mother Knot was when I became a mother, I first read Tilly Olsen, and her depiction of motherhood, as you said, especially in I Stand Here Ironing, which is about maternal guilt and a woman whose daughter has gotten into trouble in school. And the school social worker comes to see her about her daughter. And as she stands there ironing, she's terrified and worried about what has happened to her daughter, and maybe it's her fault. But in the end, she comes to understand that, like most people in the world, she hopes her daughter will become at least some of what she was intended to be. And it's a classic work about motherhood, but that and the other stories in Tell Me a Riddle were the first works that I read in fiction that really exposed the internal life of a mother. This was a working class mother whose conflicts between work and motherhood were very powerful, more powerful than what I had to go through, because I was married and so was Tilly Olsen, but I was a different generation, and I was in graduate school when I had my first baby. And then I began to teach soon after that. But just the fact that Tilly Olsen and others like Grace Paley were actually acknowledging, one, the complexities of the identity of being a mother, at a time when mother blaming was very, very pervasive, as you said. We were in an impossible position. Everything we did was given such weight that it seemed like every move would result in either pathology or criminality in our children. There was very little room for freedom, and there was very little room, as you said, for variation. And that is what I also try to talk about in the foreword to Tell Me a Riddle in Spanish. By the way, I just want to stop for a minute to thank Magda Angles and Las Afueras for bringing two of my books, the one about motherhood and the one about my father, to Spanish language edition. I'm so grateful to them. So that's the end of my parentheses. But I do want to just finish by saying that Tilly Olsen, she had a great impact on me. She was sent the manuscript of The Mother Knot right before it was published. And she wrote to me. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven, that I would now meet her in person. And we became very good friends. We both had very similar left-wing radical backgrounds, even though she was old enough to be my mother and of a different generation. So she was very supportive of me and of my work until she died, really. Mm-hmm. And her work has influenced my whole generation of writers in terms of her willingness to talk about the issues of class In one story, the story in that book called Oh Yes, she also talks about race, but not centrally the way other writers that you mentioned have done. But she talks about being a mother, being a wife, being a working mother, working class mother, and all of the ways in which that has impeded and restricted women from really telling our own stories in art.
Okay. And then, well, you talk about this, you talk about all these contradictions, you talk about all these layers of in the life of a person, like class, race, gender, these things. But you also talk very much about, in your book, you also talk very much about the personal experience that is different from the experience of anyone else. And then it came to my mind the fact that it seems as if, you know, Of Woman Born, which was published in 1976, is the theory, like separating the motherhood as an institution from motherhood as experience. And then the mother knot seems to be, you know, the practical counterpart, the experience of this or the example of this. So how can you explain this?
You mean, can I explain my relationship to the book Of Woman Born?
No.
So I didn't read Of Woman Born until after The Mother Knot was published, because the two books were published almost at the same time. I already knew Adrienne Rich was already a famous poet. That was the second epiphany of my young life, that Adrienne Rich wrote to me after she read a manuscript. I sent the manuscript. I had the, I don't know whether it was the bravery or the, I don't know what, the Jewish word chutzpah, the nerve to send my manuscript to Adrienne Rich, but she responded and offered me the comment that you showed on the front of the book. That was the Beacon edition. And the picture was a painting by Alice Neel, very famous American painter, of her daughter-in-law looking terrified when she's holding her baby. So I met Adrienne Rich and we talked a lot about motherhood. And then when I read Of Woman Born, it put so much into place for me in terms of her analysis of what she called the experience, which she talks about in that book in a memoir form, and then the institution of motherhood that we were all then, and I would say probably continuing now, subject to the institutional expectations of this personal identity, which we all struggle with. And she named the contradiction with her discussion of the institution and the experience of motherhood. Yeah. She also talks about motherhood and violence. She talks against the idealization of motherhood and of mothers that you described in your talk, which was extremely important to many, many writers of my generation and on from there.
Yeah, you talk about idealization of motherhood, and there are things that are never told to us, like the body. This is something I know you are very interested in, and I only mentioned once in my talk because I didn't have time for more. But it's true that there is, on the one hand, this idealization of motherhood, and on the other hand, the fact that this change in the body is never talked about. It's kind of hidden, a kind of hidden thing. Why do you think is it so important?
I think that the idealization of motherhood has deep and broad historical roots everywhere in the world. You described some of this through literature, but everywhere in the world that I know of, this is the case. And the split between what you called the Madonna, the mother, and the whore, which is really the sexual woman, is exemplified in Mary and Virgin Mary on the one hand and Mary Magdalene on the other hand in Jewish and Christian mythology. It's all through Greek mythology. It's everywhere. So many writers, as you know, are beginning to rewrite some of those classic mythologies from the point of view of women, from the point of view of daughters and mothers. To me, one of the most powerful influences on me and many, many, many American writers is Beloved by Toni Morrison, in which those two dichotomies are brought together because Sethe, the mother, is a very deeply sexual woman who's very much in love with this man, Paul D, who also was enslaved with her at the plantation that he escaped from and she escaped from. And she was so devoted to her children. It sounds unbelievable, but it's based on a true story that she actually killed one of her children so that that child would not be returned to slavery when the slave catchers came to try to return them all to their enslaved plantation where they had lived. In the very end of that book, which is to me one of the great lines in literature, world literature, she has lost the daughter who has been haunting her. And she says to Paul D, who she was in love with, about her daughter, she says, "She was my best thing." And he says, "No, Sethe, you are your best thing, you." And the very last line of the book is Sethe saying, "Me? Me?"
Yeah.
And whenever I say those words or speak them or read them, I start to cry because I think that's the essence of what we could call the de-idealization of motherhood, that you're just an ordinary woman with a body that is completely transformed when you're pregnant and give birth. And then gradually, as your children grow older, you reclaim your body again and your sexuality again in many different ways. As many women as there are probably different ways.
Yes. Yeah, it looks as if, well, being a mother is only one of the aspects of being a woman. It doesn't mean that to be a woman, you need to be a mother. It's just one of the aspects of it. And then, well, there's the sexual part of a woman, and then there's the motherly part of a woman. And in this novel, it's true that it's going in this direction. Yeah. And then I just wanted to ask you perhaps a last question before we start receiving questions from people seeing us. You were very interested in talking about the maternal attitude that you expect from fathers. Well, in the Mother Note, you talk about the fact that you were motherless from a very young age, and your father brought you up, and well, your father seems to perform the mother role, right? So what do you think about this? Do you think that men should start having this maternal attitude so that we can have a kind of shared parenting? Is this what should be done nowadays or should happen nowadays in households? What do you think?
I think that it's already happened in many different homes and households. It started happening when I gave birth. That is when my husband became much more of a maternal parent over the years. And my son, who has the 19-year-old daughter, has certainly been what you would call a maternal father. But yes, my father became a single father when my mother died, when I was 7 and my younger sister was 4. He, in some ways, he had always been the more at-home parent for various reasons. And I tell the story in The Communist and the Communist's Daughter, which just came out in Spain, actually. But he was very unusual in doing that. Many fathers of his generation, especially immigrant fathers, which he was, would probably have turned us over to a grandmother or an aunt. But he raised us as a single father. And with all the problems and conflicts that you would expect a child to have with their mother, I had with my father. But eventually, especially when he became a grandfather, which he did for 2 years before he died, we had a very profound reconciliation in many ways. And I was always very grateful to him for the maternal care that he took of us, even though as an American communist, that was not in the philosophy at the time that he was used to. But for some reason, he found it within him, the desire to make my sister and myself, in some ways, the priority of his life, to spend, in spite of the fact that he was still an active radical throughout our lives, throughout our childhoods.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that in this sentence, that the personal is political, the personal change or the change that has to take place in the domestic domain is this shared parenthood, so that women can go outside and have a role in society?
Yes, there are many works that are exploring that change now, both in film and in literature and across the board, really, in the arts, certainly in poetry. I think it's a very complex issue, Anna, as you know. What is it that makes one a woman is very much being interrogated now by many people. The whole issue of gender is under interrogation right now. What is it that makes a person a man? How do we distinguish destructive masculinity with all of its intrinsic violence from another kind of compassionate maternal masculinity, which a lot of men have written about and spoken about, and I suppose enacted in their own families at this point. We're right in the midst of all of this change still, even after 3 generations, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we can see if there's some question in the chat, because, well, I cannot see if there's some. Just a second. Okay, so far there's no question by the people seeing our session. So if you want to ask something, just leave the question in the chat. So I think we can keep talking a little bit. I just wanted to ask you about the present time, you know, about the so-called fourth wave feminism, which is the feminism taking place from around 2012 to now, with all this Me Too movement, which is spreading through the internet, through social networking sites, and which focuses more on violence against women and sexual liberation, these type of things, but in a way doesn't focus that much on domesticity, right? So what do you think? Why do you think this is so? Why do you think feminism has changed now in the 21st century?
I'm sure there are many, many reasons why it has changed. I think it's very important for us to make distinctions about class and about race when we talk about these things. I think working class women and poor women are struggling with demands and contradictions and oppressions that wealthier women are not. Many of the women in the Me Too movement who are most in the forefront of it are women who have political or academic or artistic positions, who are being in some ways sexually exploited by men who are over them. It's very recent. When I became a professor at the New School, when I was in my early 40s, so that's 35 years ago, it was still very, very common for male professors to have affairs with their students, to be seductive of their students, and certainly for a male professor who had authority over a young woman professor or teacher or assistant professor to also, and certainly when I was in college also, for male professors to have these sexual expectations. So there's a very long and difficult history of this. And I think a lot of young women who have the opportunity and the accessibility to voice are voicing that that oppression and that resistance to that oppression today. I don't, I do think that women who are of color, working class women of color, and working class white women and poor women across the board are dealing with such profound contradictions here and probably in Spain and everywhere that go well beyond what we're talking about right now. There's the ability, and especially during this year of COVID and the quarantine. I mean, we've all heard a lot about what young mothers like yourself and others have had to endure in terms of working, taking care of their children, teaching their children. It's a very particular kind of history that I'm sure in coming years, there will be books written about this year and what women have had to go through.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I wouldn't like to leave them unanswered. There's Joanne who asks, Dear Jane, apart from the 20th century works that have influenced you so much, like Olsen, Morrison, etc., are there any other earlier classic work of American or European literature that you would also list as reference for you?
I think one of the books that has influenced me in many, many ways as a writer, and in some ways as a mother, is Virginia Woolf's work, To the Lighthouse, especially. You know, Lily Briscoe in To the Lighthouse is an artist. She's not the biological daughter of Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse, but she's imagines herself in some ways as a daughter figure. And what Virginia Woolf does with that daughter figure who is an artist and yet wants to be mothered by the mother figure, Mrs. Ramsay, that replicates Virginia Woolf's own experience. Her mother died when she was 12. And she said, Virginia Woolf said that until she wrote that book, she was not free of always thinking about her mother and imagining her mother. She didn't have children, but that book in English literature had a huge impact on me as an artist, but also as a mother. When I read it as a much older woman, I found myself identifying more with Mrs. Ramsay, the mother figure, who is trying to provide everything for everybody in her circle. And she can't. She fails in various ways. So that's one book that I would definitely identify as a work that had a huge impact on me. I've read it many times and taught it many times. The book that you referred to, Harriet Jacobs' narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, had a huge impact on me. This is about a young mother who's enslaved, who actually hides in an attic for 7 years. And from that attic, she engineers the liberation of her children from slavery and finally escapes herself. So it's an incredibly heroic story about a mother, which I've also read many times and which has influenced me.
Yeah, I'll include them in the list of suggestions for our website. Yes. And well, there are a couple of more questions. Magda Angles asks, thank you for your wonderful and intelligent talk. It is a pleasure to listen to both of you. The British novelist Doris Lessing connects both Anna Casablancas and Jane Lazarre somehow. Could Jane Lazarre tell if she was an influence to her and how? Thank you.
Well, when I was young, way before I had children, I read The Golden Notebook. And like most women in my generation who were reading in English, that book almost changed our lives. The fact that she was writing as a mother, that she was writing as a sexual woman about an affair that she had, but also, for me, very importantly, she was writing in a mixed genre way. She wrote within that novel, she had a memoir, she had the primary fiction, then she had fiction written by the fiction writer in the memoir. So I was very, very influenced by her as a writer. And once when I heard her speak at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, she said something like a mother, she was talking about the Golden Notebook. And she said she had written it without any feeling that she was doing something radical, but she was doing something very radical when she wrote that book. And it had a huge influence on me. Later books of hers where she wrote about mothers, some of them had an influence on me, not as much as some other American writers. When I taught Doris Lessing much later in my life, and I taught the Golden Notebook, I realized it was very profoundly homophobic, which I did not, it wasn't in my mind to think about that, I'm sorry to say, when I read it when I was maybe in my 20s, but it is. So it's both a life-changing novel and it's also a very faulted novel in some ways. And she also, in the end, spoke very negatively about feminism, which of course I regretted, although I was happy to see her get the Nobel Prize finally.
Yeah.
She was a very important writer in many ways for me.
Yeah, that's true that once you read the Golden Notebook, you become obsessed about this book, and then it's impossible to read it only once because the second time you read it, you see different things. But well, anyway, we could be talking about the Golden Notebook for 24 hours. And I just want to ask you the next question that we have in the chat, and which apparently is going to be the last one. Joanne again says, will the new forms of transgender sexuality offer new models of motherhood that have not been explored yet in cultural terms?
Yes, are you asking me about that?
Yeah, this is a question that is written in the chat.
It's one of the things I was thinking about when I said, I'm sure there are going to be so many novels and memoirs about motherhood in the next generation that are going to change further in very dramatic ways our notions of what it means to be a mother. Trans women who are mothers, or men who are raising children as mothers, who are trans or not trans. I mean, all of these different identities, out of those identities are bound to come artists who want to write about their experiences. And I'm thinking, I might be ignorant, there might already be a novel like this, but there will be, I'm sure, a renaissance of literature by people who have intersectional identities, as you put it.
Yeah, I think there will be some kind of reformulation of what motherhood is, because, well, gender is being, redefined in a way. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And
So
maybe there will be more stories of old mothers, of very grown-up children, because those are stories that are very important and hard to tell.
yeah. Yeah, it's true that normally the stories about motherhood are about mothers of very young children.
And yet motherhood is lifelong. It's lifelong.
Exactly.
My children are almost middle-aged themselves. They are. And motherhood is still an intrinsic part of my identity.
Yeah. And yeah, there are experiences in late motherhood or in mothers that are aged with grown-up children that can add a lot to the experience, because at the beginning, when they are small children, you see motherhood in one way, but then everything, years add experience to that. Yes. So if we have to define our experience as mothers, we cannot stop when they are grown-ups. We have to go on until we die, because there's always, you know, new experiences in motherhood. Yeah,
that's right, Anna. I agree with you.
Well, if you want to add something, please go, and otherwise we're going to stop here.
No, I just want to thank you very much for your interest in my work and for your very interesting talk and for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your collaboration and your help to the Institute, and for, well, sending me so many nice emails talking about literature. I think we'll go on with this, and we'll go on discussing literature and feminism and motherhood. And well, it's been a pleasure for me.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you.